One of the most extraordinary Antarctic explorers in history was Ernest Shackleton. He's known for his extraordinary leadership and unwavering perseverance in the face of overwhelming adversity. From 1914 to 1917, he led the disastrous Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, seeking to make the first land crossing of the Antarctic continent. But it all went wrong. Relentless pack ice trapped and eventually crushed his ship, the Endurance, and Shackleton and his 27 crew members were stranded in one of the world's most hostile and strange environments. In order to ensure his men's rescue, he displayed unmatched fortitude and strategic cunning, planning a risky expedition to Elephant Island, and then embarked on a historic open-boat journey to South Georgia. His dedication to his crew's safety made sure that everybody made it through the ordeal, despite a number of difficulties, such as severe weather, scarce supplies, and the treacherous waters. Of course, he's known for his explorations, but beyond all of this, there's so much more before and after the journey to the Arctic. And so, today we go through the life of Ernest Shackleton, one that embodies the value of bravery, friendship, and tenacity. And welcome to the channel, everyone. Here we are, going back to somewhat modern history, which is a good change for the channel. So if you like this sort of stuff, let me know. Tell me where you're listening from, and perhaps give me a few, suggestions in the comments. And perhaps I'll make a video that is to your liking. Now, with all that out of the way, you know what to do. Get nice and relaxed, and we may begin. And the story begins in Ireland, County Kildare, in a little place called Kilkea, February 15th, 1874, where Ernest Shackleton was born. Henry Shackleton, his father, became a farmer and settled in Kilkea after his poor health had prevented him from joining the British Army, which was pretty much the career choice of the day if you weren't building ships for the British Navy. Now, West Yorkshire is where the Shackleton family is originally from in England. They trace their origins back to there. Abraham Shackleton, an English Quaker who immigrated to Ireland in 1726 and established a school in Ballator, County Kildare, was the ancestor of Shackleton's father. And that's pretty much the most notable one. Henrietta Letitia Sophia Gavan, Shackleton's mother, was a Fitzmaurice descendant. Ernest was the first of 2 sons and the second of 10 children. His second son, Frank, had gained notoriety as a suspect in the alleged theft of the Irish crown jewels in 1907, and by the way, they are yet to find them. Well, either way, it mustn't have been Frank because he was later cleared, but there's a little bit of a historical mystery for you. So, that is the background, at least at a cursory glance. But let's get back to Ernest. Now, when he was 6 years old, his life was somewhat uprooted. This was in 1880. His father made a decision to pursue a medical degree at Trinity College in Dublin. And so they all packed up and left to go to the big city. So they relocated to the London suburb of Sydenham 4 years after leaving Ireland. In addition to the newly qualified doctor's desire for better career opportunities, the family's Anglo-Irish heritage may have contributed to this, as Irish nationalists had killed the British Chief Secretary for Ireland, Lord Frederick Cavendish, in 1882. Very damaging to relations between the two peoples. Well, nevertheless, Shackleton claimed to be an Irishman and took pride in his Irish heritage throughout his life. So, from the earliest years, he was also an avid reader, which of course fueled his desire for exploration. Not quite at the tail end of the golden age of exploration, but certainly getting there. Before he started attending Fir Lodge Preparatory School in West Hill, Dulwich, southeast London, at the age of 11, he was already educated by a governess. He enrolled in Dulwich College when he was 13 years old. When he was younger, though, Shackleton didn't really stand out as much of a scholar, and reportedly he was bored with his studies. And that is a bit of a trend that runs, doesn't it? Some people just seem to outpace the monotony of traditional education. Being stuffed into that little box, it kind of clips their wings. I'm sure Shackleton is not the first, nor the last. Perhaps you see a bit of yourself in that statement. Well, either way, in his final term at school, he did manage to place 5th in his class of 31 students. Not the best, but not certainly the worst. He was later quoted as saying, "I never learned much geography at school. Literature, too, consisted in the dissection, the parsing and analyzing of certain passages from our great poets and prose writers. Teachers should be very careful not to spoil their pupils' tastes for poetry all the time by making it a task and an imposition. And he is damn right. I remember English classes in my school. Always the English teacher would dissect some what I thought to be quite a meaningless passage from the text, and we would spend so much time trying to dredge up a deeper meaning behind a very simple thing that the whole story just became so labored and no one could really enjoy it. But anyway, I digress. Well, apparently, Shackleton was a little bit of a naughty boy in school, quite disruptive, and because of this, he was permitted to leave and go out to sea at the age of 16. A Royal Navy officer cadetship in Britannia at Dartmouth was one possibility, but that was a little bit too expensive. And in 1888, Shackleton was older than the 14.5 age limit. There were other options. They included an apprenticeship before the mast, as they used to call it, on a sailing vessel, or the mercantile marine cadetships Worcester and Conway. Both pretty good options. And so, this third option was selected. His father managed to get him a spot on the square-rigged sailing ship Houghton Tower with the Northwestern Shipping Company. A pretty good entry level, especially for someone with no experience. And so Shackleton spent the following 4 years at sea learning his craft, traveling the world, making a wide range of friends, each more interesting than the next, interacting with people from all walks of life, high and low. He passed the test to become a second mate in August of 1894 and took position as a third officer on a Welshshire Line tramp steamer. After obtaining his first mate's ticket 2 years later, he became a certified master mariner in 1898. And that meant a lot, because that allowed him to command a British ship anywhere in the world. He began working for Union Castle Line, the regular mail and passenger service between South Africa and Britain, in 1898. According to one of his shipmates, Shackleton was a departure from our usual type of young officer, happy to be by himself, but not distant, spouting lines from Keats or Browning, and a mix of sensitive and aggressive, but not callous. After the Boer War broke out in 1899, Shackleton moved to the troop ship Tintagel Castle. It was there that he met the Army Lieutenant Cedric Longstaff in March 1990. That name sounds like something from Harry Potter, doesn't it? Cedric Longstaff. Well, Longstaff's father, Llewellyn Longstaff, was the primary financier of the British National Antarctic Expedition, which was at that time being planned in London. So, in order to secure a spot on this expedition, Shackleton used his relationship with the son to get an interview with Longstaff Sr. His eagerness impressed him, and Longstaff made it apparent that he wanted Shackleton accepted when he recommended him to the expedition's overlord, Sir Clements Markham. And so, it's always not what you know, but who you know. He was officially appointed as the expedition's third officer of the ship Discovery on February 17th, 1901, and on June 4th, 1901, he received his Royal Navy commission as a sub-lieutenant in the Royal Navy Reserve. Now, this marked the end of Shackleton's merchant navy service, despite his official leave from Union Castle. And on to Sir Clements Markham, the Royal Geographical Society president. He was the driving force behind the British National Antarctic Expedition, which had been planned for many years and was named the Discovery Expedition after the ship Discovery. The expedition's goals included geographical and scientific exploration, and it was led by one Robert Falcon Scott, a Royal Navy torpedo lieutenant who had been promoted to the role of commander. And so, Scott made the crew, officers, and the scientific staff of Discovery comply with the requirements of the Naval Discipline Act, which meant that the ship and the expedition were operated according to Royal Navy procedures, even though the Discovery was not a Royal Navy unit. Despite his own training and instincts favoring a different, less rigid style of leadership, Shackleton reluctantly agreed to this approach. After all, it's a new career move for him. May as well give it a try. According to the list, he was specifically responsible for in charge of sea water analysis, wardroom catering, in charge of the holds, stores, and provisions, and also arranging the entertainments. On July 31st, 1901, Discovery left London's East India docks and reached the Antarctic coast on January the 9th, 1902. After passing through Madeira, Cape Town, and New Zealand, on February 4th, Shackleton participated in an experimental balloon flight after landing, along with the scientists Hartley T. Ferrer and Edward A. Wilson. He took part in the first sledging trip from the expedition's winter quarters in McMurdo Sound, which created a secure path to the Great Ice Barrier. Throughout the Antarctic winter of 1902, Shackleton was confined to the icebound Discovery and served as editor of the South Polar Times, the expedition's magazine that proved to be quite entertaining for all the passengers. Now, Steward Clarence Hare claimed that Shackleton was the most popular of the officers among the crew, and he was quite a good mixer. However, there's no real evidence to support the idea that is constituted in an reported unofficial rivalry to Scott's leadership. Maybe that was just a bit of a rumor. Could be, though. Everybody wants to be popular. Well, Shackleton was selected by Scott to march south with Wilson and himself on the expedition's southern journey, which aimed to reach the highest latitude in the direction of the South Pole. Although Scott placed a high value on reaching a high latitude and Shackleton's inclusion demonstrated a high level of personal trust, this was not a serious attempt on the pole. The group, though, departed on November the 2nd, 1902. Scott later described it as a bit of a combination of failure and success. They still managed to surpass the previous record, though, set by Kirsten Boch-Grevning in 1900 by reaching the farthest south latitude of 8217 south. But the poor performance of the dogs, who had become quickly ill after their food had become contaminated, completely ruined the trip. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to tell you, the march claimed the lives of all 22 dogs. Of course, the men didn't fare that nicely either. They all got frostbite, snow blindness, and at various points had to suffer with scurvy. Shackleton admitted that he had broken down on the return trip and was unable to complete his portion of the work. It was not a good time for anybody involved, that's for sure. Not the kind of adventure they were hoping for. And so, in the voyage of the Discovery, he subsequently refuted Scott's assertion that he had been carried on the sledge, which he thought was a little bit of dramatic writing, perhaps some character assassination. There was also Wilson's journal entry for January 14th, 1903, that stated, "Shackleton has been anything but up to the mark, and today he is decidedly worse, very short-winded, coughing constantly, with more serious symptoms which need not be detailed here, but which are of no small consequence 160 miles from the ship, and full loads to pull all the way." Now, he's not really calling him lazy. He's just describing his conditions. I mean, there's definitely a long way back to the ship with all of that equipment. And he was gravely weakened, regardless of the circumstance. So, at last, February the 3rd, 1903, the shattered and broken group finally returned to the ship. Scott chose to send Shackleton home on the relief ship Morning. That's M-O-R, not M-O-U-R. They wouldn't dare call it that. And Morning landed in McMurdo Sound in January, following an inconclusive medical examination. Scott had wrote, he ought not to risk further hardships in his present state of health. It is speculated that Scott removed Shackleton because he was resentful of his popularity and used his illness as a pretext to do so. Could be, but once again, speculation. Now, the expedition's second in command, Albert Armitage, had said that there'd been a falling out on the southern voyage, and Scott had warned the ship's doctor that, if he does not go back sick, he will be in disgrace, years after the deaths of Scott, Wilson, and Shackleton. Now, there is no evidence to support Armitage's account. Until Scott's description of the southern voyage was published in the Voyage of the Discovery, Shackleton and Scott maintained their cordial relationship. Although they seemed friendly and respectful to each other in public, The biographer Roland Huntford claims that Shackleton's attitude towards Scott was indeed deteriorating, and he described it as smouldering scorn and dislike in order to restore his damaged pride. A return to the Antarctic and an attempt to outdo Scott was necessary. Well, back in good old New Zealand, Shackleton was recuperating, and he got quite a bit better before traveling back to England via New York and San Francisco, the long way. On being the first notable individual to return from the Antarctic, he discovered that he was in high demand. Specifically, the Admiralty wanted to speak with him regarding its future plans for the Discovery's rescue. He declined the chance to sail with her as chief officer, but with the approval of Sir Clements Markham, he took a temporary position helping to outfit the Terra Nova for the second Discovery relief operation. Additionally, he helped outfit the Argentine Uruguay, which was being prepared to aid Otto Nordenskjöld's stranded Swedish Arctic expedition. And so in 1903, seeking a more permanent and stable job, Shackleton used the supplementary list as a back door to apply for a regular commission in the Royal Navy. It didn't work out. His application failed because the list was closed, even though Markham and the Royal Society President William Huggins had sponsored it. So he resigned his RNR commission the following year, despite the Admiralty's suggestion that he could be promoted to lieutenant in the Royal Naval Reserve if he met the requirements. And that would have set him up for life, that's for sure. So, instead of doing all that, he chose to work as a journalist for the Royal Magazine instead. But he got tired of it pretty quickly. Either way, after accepting another offer, he began serving as a secretary of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, or RSGS, January the 11th, 1904. And then he got married to one Emily Dorman 3 months later on April 9th, and they had 3 children. One, Edward, who was also an explorer before becoming a politician, and the other 2, Raymond and Cecily, with, well, somewhat boring careers, I'm sure. Now, Shackleton invested in a speculative business in 1905, with the goal of becoming wealthy by bringing Russian soldiers home from the Far East. Bit of a risky plan, and nothing really came of it, even though he assured Emily, his wife, that it was a sure thing. Yeah, I bet he copped some grief when it didn't work out from her. He also dabbled in politics, running, albeit unsuccessfully, against Irish Home Rule in the 1906 general election as the candidate of the Liberal Unionist Party for the Dundee constituency. Meanwhile, he had accepted a position with William Beardmore, a wealthy industrialist from Clydeside, later Lord Invernan, on a roving commission that included entertaining Beardmore's business associates and conducting interviews with potential clients. So by this point, he was openly expressing his desire to lead his own expedition back to Antarctica. After all, he'd been on dry land for so long. Dry, comparatively warm land. He was getting bored. Surely the pull of adventure is a lot more entertaining than working as a journalist or for the Royal Geographic Society. He was keen to go and make something of his life. Well, as for Beardmore, he was impressed enough by Shackleton to provide financial assistance, but it was difficult to find other donors, However, Shackleton presented his Antarctic expedition plans to the Royal Geographical Society in February 1907, and the details were published in the Geographical Journal, the RGS newsletter, under the name British Antarctic Expedition. Very creative. The goal was to conquer the South Magnetic Pole, as well as the South Pole geographically. He then put a lot of effort into convincing other wealthy friends and acquaintances to contribute, such as author Campbell McKellar, Guinness Baron Lord Evey, and Sir Philip Lee Brocklehurst, who actually contributed up to £2,000 in the day's money, or about £260,000 in nowadays money. And this effectively got him a guaranteed spot on the expedition. His contribution was obtained less than 2 weeks prior to the expedition ship Nimrod's departure. Well, the British Antarctic expedition began on the 7th of August 1907, when the Nimrod sailed from England, arriving in New Zealand at the end of November. On January the 1st, 1908, the expedition left Lyttelton Harbour for the Antarctic after making a few last-minute preparations. Prior to departing England, Shackleton was under pressure to give Scott an agreement not to base himself in the McMurdo area, which Scott was claiming as his own territory. Shackleton had originally intended to launch his attempts on the South Pole and South Magnetic Pole from the old Discovery base in McMurdo Sound. Reluctantly, Shackleton consented to look for winter quarters at King Edward VII Land, or the Barrier Inlet, which he had briefly visited on the Discovery earlier in 1902. Shackleton convinced the Union Steamship Company and the New Zealand government to split the cost, and the steamer Cunha towed the ship 1,600 miles to the Antarctic ice to save coal. Following Shackleton's pledge to Scott, the ship sailed towards the Great Ice Barrier's eastern sector, reaching it on January 21st, 1908. They named it the Bay of Whales, as soon as they realized that the Barrier Inlet had grown to create a sizable bay that was home to hundreds of whales. What a sight to see. Of course, back then, one of the biggest industries, maybe it was a little bit late for the whaling industry, once petroleum and everything came in for slow-burning lamp oil, that kind of died out. But at one point, whaling was the biggest industry in the world. Well, an extended search for an anchorage at King Edward VII Land was equally fruitless, and the ice conditions were unstable enough to prevent the establishment of a safe base at Barrier Inlet. The Nimrod sailed for McMurdo Sound after Shackleton was compelled to renounce the commitment he had made to Scott. Second Officer Arthur Harbord stated that this choice was dictated by common sense, given the challenges of ice pressure, the lack of coal, and the absence of any other known nearby base. January the 29th, the ship reached McMurdo Sound, but ice stopped it 16 miles north of Hut Point, the former base of the Discovery. A base was eventually established at Cape Royds, approximately 24 miles north of Hut Point, following significant weather delays. Despite the challenging circumstances, the group was cheerful and concentrated because of Shackleton's ability to connect on a more personal level with his crew. No stuffed shirt, stiff upper lip British naval commander. One of the lads. Now Shackleton and his 3 friends, Jameson Adams, Eric Marshall, and Frank Wild, embarked on the Great Southern Journey on October the 29th, 1908. They arrived at the farthest south latitude of 8823 on January 9, 1909, about 112 miles, or 180 kilometers from the pole. Along the way, the four men became the first to see and travel on the South Polar Plateau, and they also found the Beardmore Glacier, which was named after Shackleton's patron. I'm sure he was quite happy about that, definitely getting his money's worth. They were confined to half rations, however, for the majority of their return trip to McMurdo Sound, which was, of course, a race against starvation. In that cold, you suddenly burn up a lot of calories, and if you're not replenishing them, well, you know what happens. Fortunately, just in the nick of time, the group returned to Hut Point, just to catch the ship. Edgeworth David, Douglas Mawson, and Alistair Mackay reached the approximate location of the South Magnetic Pole on January 16, 1909, and the first ascent of Mount Erebus were among the other major achievements of the British Antarctic Expedition. After his triumphant return to the United Kingdom, Shackleton quickly published his work, The Heart of the Antarctic, his own personal account of the expedition. His wife, Emily, subsequently wrote, "The only comment he made to me about not reaching the pole was a live donkey is better than a dead lion, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, darling, as far as I'm concerned." And we left it at that. In 1910, Shackleton used an Edison phonograph to record 3 short recordings in which he gave a brief account of the expedition. A distilling company recovered several mostly undamaged cases of whiskey and brandy that had been abandoned in 1909 for examination in 2010. The New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust, which had uncovered these lost spirits, received a portion of the sales from the revival of the vintage formula for the specific brands that were found. Of course, Shackleton was received very well. Public honors were soon to follow his return. On July 10th, 1909, King Edward VII received him and promoted him to Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. In November, he was knighted, and made Sir Ernest Shackleton in the King's birthday honors list. He received a gold medal from the RGS. A suggestion to give him a medal that was smaller than the one Captain Scott had previously received was not carried out, and quite rightly. On November 23rd, each member of the shore party of the Nimrod expedition was awarded a silver polar medal. Shackleton was given a clasp to affix to his previous medal. A notable distinction for British mariners, he was also named a younger brother of the Trinity House. Shackleton maintained a rigorous schedule of public appearances, lectures, and social engagements in the immediate aftermath of his return. He then tried to make a fortune in business in an attempt to capitalize on his fame. The development of a Hungarian mining concession he had purchased close to the city of Nagbanya, which is now in Romania, a tobacco company, and a plan to sell collector's special postage stamps overprinted King Edward VII land, based on his appointment as Antarctic postmaster by the New Zealand government, were some of the endeavors that he hoped to support. Well, varying results. I don't know why he thought the stamps were going to be good. I suppose stamp collecting's a bit of a thing, but it's a lot of work for a small return. Either way, none of these businesses were really successful. So his primary source of income came from giving lectures. Even after relocating to Sheringham, Norfolk with his family in September of 1910, he wrote to Emily, "I am never again going south, and I have thought it all out. My place is at home now. In February 1910, he had written to the RGS about a scientific expedition that was discussing with Douglas Mawson regarding a trip to the Antarctic coast between Cape Adare and Gorsberg. The outcome of Scott's Terra Nova expedition, which had set sail from Cardiff on June 15, 1910, would determine whether Shackleton would resume his search for the pole in the future. I'm sure his wife, Emily, probably knew that there was an allure of exploration that he couldn't really forget. She knew who she married, surely. Well, although the world knew by early 1912 that Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian, had conquered the pole, Scott's expedition's fate was unknown at the time. Shackleton's thoughts shifted to a plan for a continental crossing via the South Pole, which was first proposed by British explorer William Speirs Bruce, but later shelved. The plan called for a landing in Weddell Sea and an ending in McMurdo Sound. After failing to secure funding, Bruce was pleased that Shackleton would follow his plans, which were similar to those of the German explorer Wilhelm Flichner, who had departed Bremerhaven in the May of 1911. Flichner's expedition failed, and the news of this was received from South Georgia in December of 1912. The transcontinental voyage was one great main object of Antarctic journeyings that was still available to him, according to Shackleton himself. Well, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition was the grand title Shackleton gave to his new expedition when he published its details in December of 1913. In order to better select candidates for this expedition, Shackleton is said to have posted an advertisement highlighting the difficulty and peril of the planned journey. However, no record of such an advertisement has survived, and its existence is, frankly, pretty sketchy. Either way, 2 ships were used. The Aurora would transport a supporting party under Captain Aeneas Mackintosh to McMurdo Sound on the far side of the continent, while Endurance would transport the main party into Weddell Sea with the goal of reaching Varsel Bay, from where a team of 6, led by Shackleton, would start the continent's crossing. In order to provide Shackleton's party with food and fuel, they needed to finish their 1,800-mile journey across the continent. The party was entrusted with laying supply depots across the Great Ice Barrier, as far as Beardmore Glacier. Although the British government did themselves contribute about £10,000, about £1.2 million today's money, the expedition was primarily funded by private donations, with Shackleton using his considerable fundraising skills to assist. Remember how I'd mentioned that he was so human to his crew? One of the boys. Well, he was also pretty good when he was spruiking for donations too. People liked him. They believed in him. So it was easy for him to get the money that he needed. It helps when people like you. Now, tobacco heiress Janet Stancomb Wills donated an undisclosed but supposedly generous amount. Midlands industrialist Frank Dudley Docker donated £10,000, the same as the government did, and Scottish jute tycoon Sir James Caird donated £24,000. More than 5,000 people applied to join Shackleton's expedition, indicating the high level of public interest. And so his interviewing and selection techniques, well, occasionally they came across as a little bit odd. He had some unusual questions that reflected his belief that temperament and character were just as significant as technical proficiency. Physicist Reginald James was asked if he could sing. Others were accepted, either after the shortest interrogation or immediately because Shackleton liked their appearance. In order to foster camaraderie, he relaxed some of the established hierarchies. For example, he decided to divide the ship's tasks equally among the officers, scientists, and capable sailors. No job was too big or too small for any rank. They all had to work together. Every night after supper, he made it a point to mingle with his crew members by facilitating games, jokes, and even sing-alongs. In the end, he chose a crew of 56, with 28 men on each ship, divided equally. And now Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, ordered Endurance to proceed, even though the First World War had begun. And so on August the 8th, 1914, they departed British waters. Shackleton met the ship in Buenos Aires on September 27th, delaying his own departure. Now, in a telegram to the Daily Chronicle, he expressed his patriotism as he set sail for South Georgia at the end of October, stating, "We hope, in our small way, to add victories in science and discovery to that certain victory which our nation will achieve in the cause of honor and liberty." Captain Aeneas Mackintosh commanded the Aurora. Captain Frank Worsley oversaw the Endurance, and Shackleton led the expedition. Lionel Greenstreet was the first officer on the Endurance, and Frank Wild, a seasoned adventurer, was the second in command. Leonard Hussey was the meteorologist, and reportedly an absolute champion on the banjo. Well, no wonder they had him on the staff list. Geologist James Wordie was part of the scientific team led by Surgeon James McElroy. The second surgeon, Alexander Macklin, was also responsible for maintaining the health of the 70 dogs. As head dog handler, Tom Crean had more immediate responsibility. The physicist Reginald James, carpenter Harry McNish, biologist Robert Clark, and navigator Hubert Hudson were among the other crew members. On December the 5th, 1914, the Endurance set sail for Vassal Bay in the Weddell Sea from South Georgia. First-year ice slowed the ship's progress as she navigated, moving southward. Conditions steadily worsened deep in the Weddell Sea, until Endurance was quickly frozen in an ice floe, January the 19th, 1915. Shackleton ordered the ship's routine to be abandoned and her converted to a winter station on February 24th, realizing that they would be stuck until the next spring. Over the next few months, Endurance slowly moved northward with the ice. The ship's hull was under tremendous strain when spring arrived in September due to the ice breaking and subsequent movements. When water started to pour in on October 24th, Shackleton's hopes that the ship could make her way back towards Vassal Bay after being freed from the ice were all but shattered. He ordered the ship to abandon after a few days, stating that she was going down. Men, supplies, and equipment were moved to camps on the ice. The ship was then positioned at 69.5 south, and 51 degrees 30 west. Finally, on November 21st, 1915, the Endurance wreck sank below the surface. Shackleton and his group stayed on a big flat ice floe for nearly 2 months, in hopes that it would drift in the direction of Paulet Island, which was 250 miles away and was known to have stores cached there. If they could make it, then they could perhaps have something to eat, something to burn, and something to drink. Shackleton made the decision to establish a more permanent camp, titled Camp Patience. Pretty appropriate name for the camp, I suppose. On a different ice floe, and rely on the ice's drift to guide them to a safe landing after his attempts to march across the ice to this island failed. Their ice camp was within 60 miles of Powlett Island by March 17th, but they could not get there because of the impassable ice. When their ice floe split in two on April 9th, Shackleton gave the order for the crew to board the lifeboats and make their way for the closest land. At Elephant Island, 346 miles from the Endurance's sinking location, the weary men landed their 3 lifeboats following 5 terrifying days adrift at sea. For the first time in 497 days, they were finally on firm ground. But that didn't make any one of them feel safe. Frank Hurley, a photographer who had lost his mittens during the boat trip, received Shackleton's mittens because he was so worried about his own men. As a result, Shackleton's fingers became frostbitten. Elephant Island was remote from any shipping lanes, and was frankly an unfriendly place to be. Because you see, it was highly unlikely that he would be rescued by a chance discovery, Shackleton made the risky decision to travel by open boat to the whaling stations in South Georgia, where he knew assistance would be available. The James Caird, named for the expedition's principal sponsor, was selected for the journey because it was the strongest of the small 20-foot lifeboats. Harry McNish, the ship's carpenter, strengthened the keel, raised the sides, constructed a makeshift deck out of canvas and wood, and sealed the work with seal blood and oil paint, among the other improvements. Now the ship's captain, Frank Worsley, who would steer the ship, Tom Crean, who had begged to go, 2 stout sailors, John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy, and McNish were the 5 people Shackleton selected for the expedition. Shackleton and the carpenter had previously argued when the group was stuck on the ice, but despite his poor disobedience, Shackleton saw McNish's suitability for this specific position. Disagreements notwithstanding, this time skill was the deciding factor. And so, knowing that the boat and its crew would be lost if they did not arrive in South Georgia in 4 weeks, Shackleton insisted on packing only enough supplies for that duration. Launched on April 24th, 1916, the James Caird spent the next 15 days sailing the Southern Ocean, vulnerable to choppy waves and in danger of capsizing. On May the 8th, Worsley's navigational skills allowed the cliffs of South Georgia to be seen, but a hurricane-force wind made landing impossible. Offshore, the group had to weather the storm, constantly at risk of being smashed against the rocks. Later, they found that a 500-ton steamer from Buenos Aires was sunk by the same storm on the way to South Georgia, and if a 500-ton steamer can be sunk by those same waves, well, their little lifeboat certainly had proved its worth. After successfully landing on the unoccupied southern shore the following day, they had time to rest and recover. Shackleton chose to try a land crossing of the island rather than to take the chance of another sea voyage to get the whaling stations on the northern coast. No one had tried this route before, though Norwegian whalers had probably already crossed the island at other places on ski. The men had only 50 feet of rope, a carpenter's adze, and boots that they had modified for climbing by driving screws into the soles for their journey. After leaving McNish, Vincent, and McCarthy at the South Georgia landing site, Shackleton spent 36 hours traveling 32 miles through treacherous mountain terrain with Worsley and Green, arriving at the whaling station at Stromness on the 20th of May. The British explorer Duncan Carse, who followed much of the same path as Shackleton's party, made the next successful crossing of South Georgia in October of 1955. He wrote, "I don't know how they did it, except that they had to. 3 men of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration with 50 feet of rope between them and a carpenter's adze, in honor of their accomplishment." Tend to agree with him, and I like that wording, the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Yeah, that sums it up. Well, while he started planning the rescue of the men who were left behind on Elephant Island, Shackleton promptly dispatched a boat to retrieve the 3 men from the opposite side of South Georgia Island. Sea ice blocked the approaches to it, thwarting his first 3 attempts. After making an appeal to the Chilean government, he was given permission to use the Chilean Navy's Yelcho, a small seagoing tug. On August 30th, 1916, Yelcho, under the command of Captain Luis Pardo, and the British whaler Southern Sky, arrived at Elephant Island, where the men had been stranded for 4.5 months. Shackleton evacuated all 22 men. Yelcho took the group to Punta Arenas first, and then, a few days later, to Valparaiso, Chile, where the people welcomed them back to civilization. I'm sure they were very happy to be back. The Aurora, the expedition's supporting component, also experienced misfortune at the same time as the Endurance. You see, it was blown out of its anchorage and driven to sea, leaving the remaining men of the Ross Sea Party stranded at Cape Evans in McMurdo Sound, unable to return. The ship had made its way back to New Zealand after several months at sea. In order to save the Ross Sea Party, which had successfully finished its depot-laying mission in spite of the numerous obstacles, Shackleton traveled there to join the Aurora. But 3 people had died, including its commander, Aeneas McIntosh. In May of 1917, Shackleton returned to England as the First World War was raging in Europe. He volunteered for the British Army, despite having a heart condition that was exacerbated by the exhaustion of his long travels and being too old to be drafted. He was now drinking heavily and had repeatedly asked to be posted to the front in France, but he was really in no condition to be so. Too old, too drunk. Shackleton was, however, dispatched to Buenos Aires in October of 1917 in order to support the British propaganda effort in South America. Unfit to serve as a diplomat, he failed to convince Chile and Argentina to join the Allies in the war, and left for home in April of 1918. Then, for a brief period, he was part of a mission to Spitsbergen to create a British presence there while pretending it was a mining operation. But en route to Tromsø, possibly suffering a heart attack, he was hospitalized. Before leaving for northern Russia, he had to make a second trip home after being assigned to a military expedition of Murmansk. On July 18th, 1918, Shackleton received a special appointment as a temporary major under the leadership of Major General Edmund Ironside. He joined the Russian Expeditionary Force in the Russian Civil War in October of 1918, and was tasked with providing advice on the gear and Arctic training for British forces. Shackleton kept his major rank when he was eventually released from the army in October 1919, following which he resumed giving lectures, and in December of that year he released South, his own narrative of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. He started thinking about a final expedition in 1920, after growing weary of public speaking. He then had the idea of visiting the largely uncharted Beaufort Sea region of the Arctic, some serious thought, and the Canadian government showed a little bit of interest in it. He then purchased a 125-ton Norwegian sealer, Fokker 1, which he renamed Quest, using money provided by his old school friend, John Quiller Rowett. The project was renamed Oceanographic and Sub-Antarctic Expedition by Shackleton, and the Antarctic was chosen as a new destination. Although the venture's objectives were vague, they included exploring some lost sub-Antarctic islands, like Tuanaki, and circumnavigating the Antarctic continent. The entire expedition, which was dubbed the Shackleton-Rowett Expedition, was financed completely by Rowett. Shackleton recorded a farewell speech on a sound-on-film system invented by Harry Grindle Matthews on September 16, 1921, which he claimed was the first talking picture ever produced. On September 24, 1921, the expedition departed England. Many of Shackleton's former crew members were signed on with their former boss, as it were, even though some had not even received their full pay from the Endurance expedition. I mean, he did save their lives, but I'd still want to be paid. Especially after all that you went through. That please don't twist the knife by not sending us our wages after we almost died freezing to death on some drifting ice floe in the Arctic. Well, Shackleton reportedly had a heart attack when the group got to Rio de Janeiro. Quest proceeded southward, reaching South Georgia on January 4, 1922, despite his refusal to undergo a proper medical examination. Alexander Macklin, the expedition's doctor, was called to Shackleton's cabin early the following morning, after he complained of back pain and other discomfort. Shackleton responded, "You're always wanting me to give things up. What is it I ought to give up?" Macklin said, "Chiefly alcohol." A short while later, at 2:50 a.m., Macklin told Shackleton that he had been going overboard and that he should try to lead a more regular life. Well, he didn't. He had a fatal heart attack, January the 5th, 1922. Well, after performing the post-mortem, Macklin determined that the coronary artery atheroma, made worse by the overstrain during a period of debility, was the cause of death. Shackleton may have had a congenital heart defect called an atrial septal defect, or a hole in the heart, which could have contributed to his health issues, according to a recent analysis of the diaries kept by Eric Marshall, the expedition's medical officer from 1907 to 1909. Either way, perhaps, we will never know. On May the 12th, 1922, Shackleton's will was proved in London, and he passed away deeply in debt, with personal belongings only worth £556, making up his meagre estate, close to £40,000 in today's money. As for his wife, well, she outlived her husband by 14 years, and finally passed away in 1936. But there is a missing character at the end of the story, isn't it? The ship on which Shackleton made his last journey. The Quest. Well, I think you'll be as delighted as I am to find out that that wreck was discovered in June of 2024. Now, isn't that recent? A team led by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society discovered her on the sea floor off the North American coast of Newfoundland. The ship was discovered intact, 1,280 feet beneath those cold, cold waters. And with that, once again we reach the end of an adventure back in time. One perhaps you might have overlooked. Certainly worth telling. Just like everything else, it all must come to an end. But I'd like to wish you a good night and a farewell, but before I leave you, I will thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, certainly a real doctor, probably a neurosurgeon, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, do check out his channel, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, and Wendy. Thank you very much. And if you feel inclined to join me tomorrow evening, same time, same place, you know where I'll be. But until then, as always, I wish you all the best and lots of love to whatever part of the world you're occupying. Good night.